The following program is dedicated to a prehistoric human being, to the anonymous person who first captivated his fellow creatures with a story. That first story may have been a simple description, some personal history, a tall tale, a lie, a joke, some gossip, or even religious conjecture. The specific subject is immaterial. What was important was the sharing of a narrative, a basic part of human communication. This program is dedicated to that man or that woman who started it all, the unknown storyteller.
Oh, I can't believe in everything I read. A little boy blue, a lady with a shoe, and a dish run off with a spoon. A hickory dickory dock, a scholar, he's late to school. And I, like a cow, I jump over the moon.
The telling of stories is part of every culture. For eons before the beginning of recorded history, telling stories was the only way to preserve history, the only way to remember great heroes, the only way to transmit knowledge and beliefs from one generation to the next. Myths, fables, tales, and other stories are integral parts of civilization. In a book called The World of Storytelling, Anne Pawlowski points out that the first written description of an action that at least vaguely resembles storytelling appears to be in the Egyptian papyrus known as the Westcar Papyrus, recorded sometime between the 12th and the 18th dynasties, which means it was written sometime between 1300 and 2000 BC. The papyrus tells of a request by Khufu the king for a man who can tell me tales of the deeds of magicians. In her book, Pawlowski also mentions early references to storytelling in Sanskrit scripture, in sacred Buddhist writings, and in early Greek literature. Nonetheless, most experts agree that the oldest tales known to man, including Gilgamesh, Beowulf, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and many Bible stories, were probably told for centuries before they were ever recorded. In some cultures, including some of the Native American tribes, storytelling has remained of paramount importance. Living in the 20th century, it's easy to forget that men haven't always had easy access to printed materials. Obviously, the invention of printing and movable type about 1450 has had a profound effect on what is known as our oral tradition. As more and more people learn to read and write, the role of the storyteller changed. Today, storytellers are a rare breed. And despite all the talk about the influence of television and other media, one human being can still captivate another with a simple story. Consider jokes. Telling jokes is still a kind of oral tradition. They never seem quite as funny if you read them instead of hearing them told by a seasoned jokester. The power of storytelling is not to be underestimated. We're lucky to have with us today one of America's foremost storytellers. Augusta Baker has been a familiar face to thousands of children in New York City, where she had a distinguished career in the public libraries. She often told stories there and was the coordinator of children's services for many years. She has held several offices in the American Library Association and has published 3 anthologies of stories, The Talking Tree, The Golden Lynx, and Young Years. She is also widely recognized for her pioneering work with the Black experience in children's books. With Ellen Green, she is the co-author of Storytelling, Art and Technique. Welcome, Ms. Baker.
It's nice to be here, Rick.
Perhaps the best way to start is to ask you, what exactly is your definition of storytelling?
Oh, I think it's really oral communication. And storytelling takes in all kinds of communication. You talked about jokes. Well, anecdotes, riddles, all kinds of oral communication. But when I think about storytelling, I'm a traditionalist, you see. And so then I think about go all the way back historically to the time when this was man's foremost way of communicating, long before he could write books and printing machines and everything else. He kept alive the history of his group, of his tribe, of his village. In Africa, for instance, the chieftains centuries ago had storytellers attached to their courts. And the only thing that storyteller had to do was to keep alive the great feats of that particular chieftain. Sundiata was one, and he had groups of storytellers, and then one main story. That's all that person had to do, because they weren't writing down all these marvelous things he was doing, but they could tell what he was doing.
Well, what is storytelling today?
Again, it all depends upon your purpose, I think. For some people, storytelling is recreation. It's sort of having a good time. It's pleasure. I am a librarian, so I'm constantly thinking about the children to whom I tell stories. And I'm thinking about the stories today, leading the children to read books.
Okay, is the main purpose for telling stories entertainment? Why do you tell stories?
No, I really don't. I think entertainment is one. But I think when you begin to talk about the values of storytelling, then you move into the ethical values, the moral values of storytelling. I think storytelling, for instance, has great cultural value. You take one story, and for children, you can trace that story all over the world. And immediately it shows the relationship of peoples all over the world. When you're very careful in the selection of the story which you tell, the version of the story which you tell, you can, in a way, tell children even how people lived in that part of the world or how they lived in that part of the century. If you're working with literary stories, and in the New York Public, we made the distinction between folk tales and fairy tales. And we said folk tales, obviously, the stories which come from the folk. And then we have said fairy tales are the one author story. Well, now here the value there is in the use of the language. These people are word stylists, Anderson, Farjeon, Pyle. And when we tell those stories and use the exact words of the author of the stories, we are introducing boys and girls to beautiful language. Mm-hmm. So there are all kinds of, what do you want to say, fringe benefits to storytelling.
Well, how do you decide what stories to tell? Where do you find stories? Or you obviously have an idea of the kinds of stories you think are worth telling.
For one thing, I think you read a great deal, but then you use certain basic reference books, certain source books. I like Lillian Smith's book, Unreluctant Years, where she discusses the criteria for folk tales, the criteria for fairy tales. People who are beginning very often use lists. In New York Public, again, we publish one called Stories, a list of stories to tell and to read aloud. Now, if you use this list, you're being guided by storytellers. Mm-hmm. So that this helps you too. If you find stories in here and then you read the annotations of the stories, this helps. But then you must read that story yourself. Because the main thing is you must like the story. So there could be, I don't know how many, but let's say there were 300 stories in here, and 298, I could say I don't like them. But if I find 2 in there, which I like.
Well, can you make any generalizations about those stories? Are they all folk tales?
No. Folk tales and fairy tales. Then you have, when you begin to work, for instance, with older boys and girls, when you begin to work with adults, you think then of realistic stories, you see. And even middle-aged children. We've just republished a book by Marjorie Williams Bianco, called A Street of Little Shops. Now, we storytellers call that a collection of realistic stories. But they're lovely stories to tell, but they're about real little boys and girls and what's happening to them. So the storyteller does not limit his repertoire to just folk tales.
How do you decide what story to tell on what day? I mean, you must, if you know you're going to be telling a story, say, in an elementary school one day, What guides you? Just
Well, I
when?
tried to find out, first of all, the ages of the children, whether I'm telling to all boys, to all girls, or to a mixed group of boys and girls. I'd go prepared for the switch. I've had the experience of thinking that I was going to go to tell stories to a group of middle-aged girls, you know, 8 to 12-year-old girls, and going prepared to tell Eleanor Farjeon's beautiful romantic stories. And I got up to the branch, and there on the story hour line, 16 feisty little boys and not one girl. So as a storyteller, I had to pull quickly some action-packed, humorous stories to hold those little boys, because if I had gotten up there and told those romantic girl stories, I would never have reached the end of the story program, I can tell you.
Well, how exactly do you prepare for that, for a storytelling session? What do you do to prepare?
Oh, I always try to go over the stories that I'm going to tell. See, I know what I want to tell, and I know what I plan to tell, and I guess I call those others reserved stories that I know, and I'm able to pull out of that story hat if I need to. But I go prepared with a kind of a program.
There must have been a time when you were an amateur storyteller.
Oh.
How did you start? I mean,
There
where
was a
does
time-
one start?
There was a time, Rick, when the only thing that the head of storytelling could say in my favor was that I had potential. And that was all. But I wanted to be a children's librarian, and in the New York Public Library, every children's librarian tells stories. And if I had not learned to tell stories, I would have been transferred to the adult department. And though I have great respect for adults, I'm not devoted to them. I wasn't then, and I will always prefer children, you see, to adults. And so then I realized that there's work attached to being a storyteller. Even an ordinary storyteller. I don't consider myself a great, outstanding storyteller. I really don't, Rick. I'm a good storyteller. I do the best that I can do. And I have the children in mind. And as long as I know that I'm doing my best job in storytelling for the children, I'm happy. And as long as at the end of it they say they would like to read the book from which that story came, or where do we find those stories, and I can say on the fairy tale shelf.
How exactly did you find your first story? Do you remember?
Oh, yes. Yes, my children's librarian turned me loose with books, and the guidance was that the section was there, but I had to find the stories which I liked. Now, I will tell you this. I had stories as a child. I had a grandmother who told stories, you see. So I had a teacher in the elementary school who read to us. And so building up was a love for this, a love for stories, love for listening. When I went to college, one of my English teachers was a great folklorist by the name of Harold Thompson. And of course, he was always talking about New York folklore and this kind of thing. So there was a basic interest. But how to tell stories, you know, what to do with them and how to tell them in a group situation and this kind of thing, I had to learn.
Will you tell us about the story candle here, the wishing candle?
Oh, now first of all, let us make very plain that we do not use any kind of candle with small children.
Okay.
So the wishing candle in New York is saved for the middle-aged children, the story hour children, 3rd grade and up and this kind of thing. They never touch that candle. It is on the story hour table. If this were set up as our story hour table, and we'd have flowers on the table, we'd have the books on the table from which the stories come, and the candle would be there. Well, they come in and they are seated. They take their seats. And then as a storyteller, you see, I would, hold my matches and I would look at them. And they then know that the lighting of the candle means that I am going to be the only one who's going to be talking. So there's a great shush-shushing and whatnot. And then I light the candle. And I sometimes would say to them, are we all ready? Now, don't forget that while the candle is burning and while I am telling stories, you will be also thinking about the wish which you will blow in that candle at the end of the story hour.
While the candle's burning, let's take a look at a tape we have of you telling a story to some kids.
Fine. Today we're going to have a story that comes from Haiti. Now, in Haiti, there are two men. One is a big, fat, good-natured fella, and his name is Buki. Now, his best friend is a little skinny fella called Timalis. And this story is called Uncle Buki and Godfather Timalis. Now, Buki and Timalis always farmed together up in the Red Mountains. Timalis lived up the road a piece. And so he would come down the road and then he would meet Uncle Buki and they'd go up to the farm together. But this day, when he came down to the road and when he reached Uncle Buki's house, Buki wasn't ready. And he was hot outside. So Buki said to his friend, Timalis, he said, come on inside where it's a little dark and a little cool and wait for me in here. And Timalis did. Well, you know what happens if you come in from the sun and you come into where it's dark and shady. It takes a few minutes for your eyes to get used to it. But after a while, Timalis could see very well in that room. And he began to look all around, look all around. After a while, he looked up there at the ceiling, and he saw, hanging up in the ceiling, a big round gourd. Oh, I say, Buki, he said, what's that up there? And Buki looked at him. He said, now you know a gourd when you see one. It's a gourd. Oh, I know it's a gourd, said Timalis, but what I mean is, what is in it? And Buki looked at him and he said, honey. Oh boy, said Timalis, now we'll take down that gourd and we'll open it. And then we'll go outside and we'll have, each one of us will have a tall glass of nice cold water sweetened with some of that honey. But Uncle Buki pulled himself up and frowned a little bit and he said, we will not. Well, why not? Because that is a very special gourd of honey. And I'm not going to open it just for you. What's so special about it? Asked Timalis. It's special, said Buki, because Uncle Ginada gave it to me when I became the godfather for his oldest child. Now, I'm saving that honey for a special day, a day like Dessalines Day or Christmas Day, a very special day. I am not going to open it. Timalis thought a few minutes and he said, aren't we good friends? Yes. Well, when good friends get together, that's a special day. Open the gourd of honey? No, said Buki. Now, Timalis knew when to stop begging, so he didn't say anything more. The two men went on up the hill together, and when they got up to the farm, they began to hoe, and Timalis began to take the machete and the hoe, and all he could think of was a nice tall glass of ice water, sweetened with some honey. All of a sudden, he threw down his hoe and he said, shh, 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 shh. Oh, Buki, I hear voices. I think I'd better run down and see who it is and see what, it could be important. And Uncle Buki said, I hear the dogs barking and I don't hear them barking your name. Can't stop and talk about it now,
said T. Melise could be important. That rascal, T. Melise, ran down that hill, went straight to Uncle Bookie's house, got a ladder, climbed up there, took down that gourd of honey. He went outside and he opened it. He had himself a nice tall glass of cold spring water, and he sweetened it with some of that honey, and it really was so good. He had a second glass and then another glass. But I'll tell you, before he realized it, he had used 1/3 of that gourd of honey. He put that gourd back in its place. You couldn't tell it had been touched. Ran back up the hill as if he had traveled a great distance, just puffing and blowing, and when he got up there, Uncle Bookie said to him, "And where have you been? You off gallivanting someplace, and I'm up here working. Where have you been?" And T. Melise had to think, you know, real fast, and he thought, and he said, "Oh, I'm a godfather."
Well, you've captured our attention for sure.
I think it's time, Rick, now for you to blow your wish in the story hour. When I say 3, you blow. 1, 2, 3.
Now our story hour is over.
Now it's over.
Let's talk a little bit about what you were doing in the tape.
Okay.
Is the story memorized?
Not this one, but I know it so well. I think one of the things about learning a story is that you become steeped in the story. And before you begin to learn the different sections of the story, you read that story from beginning to end, and you just keep going over it and over it and over it until it's really fixed in your mind. Now, actually and unconsciously, you begin to memorize when you are not doing it deliberately. It's also very important to use exact words where the setting of the story is important. I remember Dick Chase saying, with the grandfather tale, there's a description of food. He said, if you say that John has in one hand a tall glass of milk, why, he said that story could be told any place. You must say a tall glass of sweet milk, and immediately it's in the North Carolina mountains. So even though you say you're telling the story in your own words, it means that if the book says once upon a time and you say there was once, no harm done. If it's a literary tale, then we do learn that word for word, and it takes a long time to do it.
You obviously pay a lot of attention to the speed of delivery and the timing. How do you work on that?
Well, timing is the thing that we use instead of changing the voice. You see, now there are many people, you know, who say, the bears came home, and the great big bear said, who's sitting in my chair? And the middle-sized bear said, who's sitting in my chair? And the baby bear said, who's sitting in my chair and broke down my chair? Who knows how bears talk, you see? We have been trained in New York instead to use timing. So if I were telling the story of the 3 bears, I would say, and the bears came home, and the great big bear said, who's been eating my porridge? And the middle-sized bear said, who's been eating my porridge? One of the greatest storytellers, Rick, and a master in timing was Jack Benny. And if you'll recall, you never heard Jack Benny try to imitate the voice of some other person when he was telling a story. But his timing was the thing that made all the coloration to the story.
One of the things I like best about listening to you there is that it's not too fast.
You remember people are listening. And if you go galloping through a story and they're trying to keep up with you with what they hear, and especially children, they either lose a great deal of the story or they are exhausted when you get to the end of the story.
What about parents who might be interested in telling stories to their children? It must be a different kind of art than telling stories to a group of children.
The technique is the same.
Uh-huh.
If I'm telling stories to 2 children, when I'm telling stories, for instance, to my grandchildren, I would tell it the same way. I would be telling that, maybe to a large group, I probably would, there's more eye contact, for instance. That's important too, you see, in storytelling. So that when, with a group, you don't just pick out one child and tell that story. Now, parents would, they're telling the story to the child, and the average parent's going to use a little more in the way of gestures and this kind of thing, you see. But I wouldn't with a group, but I would be sure to take in that whole group. The eye contact is very important.
How much do you play off the audience?
The audience, for me now, as a storyteller, the audience helps me. The reaction of the audience helps me. It tells me whether I'm putting my story over, whether it's going over, whether the humor is going over. If the children laugh at the right place, this helps me because I know they understand what I'm saying. And changing your voice doesn't help it. You know, raising your voice doesn't help it. You must project your voice so that the child on the last row can hear what you're saying. But you don't have to shout.
What about gestures?
Mary Gould Davis, who taught me storytelling, who was the sister of Owen Davis, the great playwright, came from a family of actors. But she told us there were no Broadway talent scouts sitting in that audience. So she said, you are unimportant. The story is the important thing. And if children remember you and forget the story, you've not been a good storyteller.
I'm interested to know a little bit about what you feel about telling family stories, stories that aren't written down, that are still like an oral tradition.
For one thing, families enjoy doing that. You know, children will ask their parents, tell me a story about when you were a little girl or when you were a little boy. This keeps alive family traditions and family history and this sort of thing. I would not want a steady diet of it because, again, I'm thinking about using my stories to introduce the children to the books. And I think more of this kind of thing is done in the home, probably with parents, than it's done in a group situation.
Do you ever think it's necessary to have costumes or?
I do not. I think they distract Rick. I really do. I think costumes, gadgets, you're telling a story and you've got finger puppets and your fingers are going all like this, and the children don't know whether to listen to the story or to look at what's going on here. I think that's a distraction. And I really believe, this is personal, but I really believe that some of these things are security blankets for the storyteller, not for the child.
Do you ever condone making up a story?
Well, if you're good enough, if you think you're good enough.